A hilltop graveyard, a storm without pause. Near a coffin made of pine, a small plastic carrier rattled in the wind. Inside, two German shepherd pups shivered, forgotten as if they had no names. No one stepped forward. No one even dared to look twice. Then a lone former Marine halted in the rain. A scar ran along his forearm, his eyes spoke only silence. He lifted the crate and made a vow no paper could ever hold. You won't freeze tonight. What followed would test a man, a town, and two fragile lives, through knocks at the door, headlights in the dark, and a decision that would turn loneliness into belonging. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Write your country down in the comments. And if you believe no person or creature should be abandoned in the cold, hit subscribe, because this story just might restore your faith in miracles. The rain fell in a steady, stubborn veil over Silver Creek, Wyoming. It blurred the outlines of the mountains into gray silhouettes and turned the cemetery hill into a slick mess of clay and pine needles. The clouds hung low like weary cattle over the ridge. Spruce and lodgepole pine combed the gusts, shedding droplets that pattered on umbrellas gathered around a narrow cut of earth. The town was present in the way small towns always are, a scattering of familiar faces who had known each other long enough to share casseroles without words, to offer pie or a prayer when life frayed at the edges. Beneath a crooked cedar, a plastic pet carrier sat at the preacher's boots. Its wire door was beaded with rain, its blue handle rubbed white from wear. Inside, two German shepherd pups pressed together like commas. A dark-coated male with paws far too big for his frame, and a quieter female, her triangular ears still soft at the tips. They trembled, and the crate trembled with them. Reverend Paul Whitcomb read from a laminated card, because paper Bibles risked ruin in weather like this. He was a spare man in his mid-50s, his coat too thin for the chill, with a face that folded kindly in laughter and folded inward when sorrow led the room. Years earlier, he had lost a daughter to black ice and a cattle guard, and ever since, he spoke gently to anything breakable. His voice carried more breath than thunder, the kind that passed over wounds without making them worse. Ashes to ashes, he said, and umbrellas dipped lower. The coffin was plain pine, closed tight, its brass already smudged with clay. The woman inside had lived alone at the far end of Mill Creek Road. She left behind shelves of mason jars, a cranky propane heater, and those pups in a crate by her back door. No one knew if she meant to raise them or give them away. No family appeared. No note remained. Questions circled, opinions whispered, though most fell silent, embarrassed into hush by Reverend Whitcomb's tenderness. Still, thin murmurs rose like steam. Whose are they then? That place of hers, she fed strays for 20 years. Animal services should take them. Cold as the devil today. They won't make a night like this in a crate. Dr. Edith May Robin stood near the head of the grave. Her raincoat was the color of dry hay, her hood down, water curling off the short silver hair tucked behind tortoise-shell glasses. 61. Spare as a fence post, tougher than one. She carried the kind of quiet grace born from delivering foals at dawn and stitching mean dogs that later turned gentle. Years ago, when the feed store caught fire, she had gone in for a cat no one liked and walked out singed, her eyebrows nearly gone, her expression making it clear the town should stop asking if she was brave and start asking how to help. She watched the carrier, not the coffin, her lips pressed thin. In the third row, townsfolk did what small towns do, they took stock of who else had shown up. Mrs. Glay from the bakery, her umbrella printed with sunflowers. A ranch hand, smelling faintly of diesel and hay. A kid with blue hair and skateboard wheels strapped to a backpack. And at the far edge of the group stood Silas Morgan. Silas was 38, his years carried more than displayed. He had the rangy build of a man who still trusted his body to work. 6 feet, shoulders squared by habit instead of swagger, his hands scarred from wrenches and rope. His hair was cropped close, dark, with a touch of gray at the temples. A weak stubble framed a mouth that rarely chose to smile. His eyes were blue-gray, sometimes steal when shutting out a thought, today rain, looking through people instead of at them. A white scar ran along his left forearm from the elbow halfway to the wrist, a reminder of a Humvee door and a bad angle where gravel looked like powder. Once, he had been a U.S. Marine, infantry first, logistics later, after a roadside blast cost him friends and his ease with loud noises. He came home quieter. The cabin he built by the tree-line was half workshop, half shelter, all practical, a pot-bellied stove, tools hung in order, a stack of firewood like a kept promise. He could fix a carburetor in his sleep, yet often forgot coffee filters. He had learned to repair things as a way of refusing to break himself. He hadn't come for the woman, only a nodding acquaintance at the feed store. But driving past the procession, something about the rain, the crate, and two small lives beside an open grave turned him up the hill. Whitcomb's prayer thinned into silence. Umbrellas shifted. Feet prepared to leave wet ground for dry rooms. No one reached for the crate. The puppies cried. The male made a small, brave sound. The female's was softer, nearly a hum in her ribs. Edith May's jaw tightened. They need heat, she said, her voice pitched to the crowd. Not to anyone in particular, they need a belly to lean against, warm milk tonight. Animal Services only has a few foster spots, someone muttered. Saturday, another said, as if the calendar could feed a dog. The preacher studied the crate like it was a psalm half forgotten. We'll find someone, he said, and meant it. But the pups shook again. Someone, another voice echoed. And the word didn't know how to become a hand. The rain stitched the seam tighter. The crate. The hole in the earth. Shoes sinking in mud. Hat brims like little roofs over closed faces. Silas felt it, that old clarity that used to settle at the edge of a patrol, the sharp moment when a choice demanded him. He could step back. He could tell himself this wasn't his ridge to stand on. He looked at his hands, as though they might vote for him. Then back at the crate. The male pup lifted a paw, almost a salute. The female tucked tighter, her eyes calm with the quiet science of survival. Silas walked forward, boots sinking in clay. Umbrellas tilted. Murmurs rose, the kind meant to sound like wisdom but nervous of being overheard. Isn't that the Marine who lives past the old logging road? Alone, isn't he? A man can barely feed himself out there. Silas crouched, his jacket soaked, and set his palm against the wire door. Warm puppy breath fogged the cold metal. The male pup, 5, maybe 6 weeks, pushed forward on stubby legs, his muzzle dark, a faint sable saddle brushed along his back. His eyes were deep brown, shameless in their need. The female waited first, a black and tan with lighter cheeks, smaller by a pound, deliberate in her steps. Her ears had not yet stood, and a thin pale streak ran down her nose as if a pencil had thought better of a bold line. A fleck of white fur touched her chest. When Silas slid the latch and opened the door, the smell of damp plastic and warm pup rose. A scent that calls childhood to the threshold and lets it in. I'll take them, he said. The words were steady, plain, ringing across the crowd like a bell's note, simple, undeniable. Reverend Whitcomb blinked against the rain, relieved in the way a man looks when he recognizes Providence in work boots. Mr. Morgan, he said, and added nothing else, as though the name itself finished the thought. You'll need heat, Edith May added, stepping closer now. Up close, the scars on her knuckles showed, old farm work etched deep, and above her brow was the nick where hair never grew back after a colt's kick. Formula 2, goat's milk if you don't have the right blend yet. We'll get some to your truck before supper. She didn't ask whether Silas knew what he was doing. Instead, she studied the way he steadied the crate, level, careful, offering the inside of his wrist to the pup so they could breathe him in before he lifted them. She nodded once, as though ticking off an item on the endless list she carried in her head. I'm up by Mill Creek, Silas said. Stove's good. Keep them closer than good, Edith answered. Close like heartbeat. Wrap them in a warm towel. Night bites hard. Behind them, someone scoffed, not cruel, just weary from money worries and weather. A lone man with a shack, the voice muttered without a name. Kibble ain't cheap. He'll be back tomorrow with regret and a bill. Edith turned slowly, her look enough to make a person wonder if they still wanted to be proud. He'll be back for more formula, she said, and they'll be heavier when he is. Silas lifted the crate. The pups pinwheeled their little paws in panic, then stilled as the sway became rhythm, as his jacket's smell, machine oil, pine smoke, damp wool, wrapped them in a story not yet told. He nodded once to the preacher, once to Edith, and finally toward the grave that made words feel too small, then carried the crate down the narrow aisle the town had left in its muddy shoes. In the gravel lot, rain shifted from thin to patient, beating on the hood of Silas's truck like a map of places he had no need to go. The F-150 was old on paper but faithful in truth, dull green with paint worn thin, a dent in the fender shaped like Idaho. Silas set the crate on the bench seat, left the door open to let heat spill out, and leaned against the frame, making a cave of warmth with his body. Valor, he said to the male, testing the word like a nail, seeing if it would hold. The pup tilted his head, tugged forward, and planted a wet nose on the inside of Silas's wrist where blue veins ran like rivers. A soft collision, clumsy and absurd, yet sharp as an arrow without an archer. "And you," Silas murmured, meeting the female's eyes as she tucked her chin into his jacket cuff draped across the crate lip. She closed her eyes, as if darkness had been made for her. Grace. The names hung in the cab, then clicked into place inside him, as if some names don't get chosen, they choose. Silas shrugged out of his jacket, folded the wool lining, and slid it through the wire, making a cave. Grace burrowed without hesitation, letting out a groan of satisfaction like a person remembering the word home. Valor licked the seam of Silas's thumb with the seriousness of a soldier delivering orders. Silas wanted to laugh and never laugh again in the same breath. By then, the lot had emptied to 3 cars and a diesel idling in the distance. Edith came down the path with a battered tote bag advertising some long-past fare. 2 bottles, she said, a smile hiding in her voice though she never let it show. Powder until I get you proper milk. Towel fresh from the dryer, it'll stay hot 10 minutes, so don't waste them. Rub their bellies after feeding or they'll bloat. And yes, pups get colicky, same as babies. Silas accepted the bag. Up close, Edith's eyes carried history, the kind of girl who once brought home every creature that limped, now older but unchanged in the habit. I owe you, Silas said. Pay me by doing it right, she answered. And tomorrow, come by the clinic. I'll weigh them, tempt them, set you a schedule. Warmth is life. Remember that. Silas nodded. She rested a hand on the crate, a benediction of touch where words would have clumsied the moment. You'll be all right, she told the pups, then glanced sideways at Silas. All 3 of you. She stepped back into the rain. Silas slid behind the wheel. The heater coughed slow warmth, the defroster painted an oval of glass on fog. Valor's nose found his wrist again, sealing whatever had been promised in silence. Grace, hidden under the jacket wool, gave a sigh so content it read as gratitude in any tongue. Silas placed the tote on the floorboard, checked the mirrors, then looked once at the hill in the rearview, where the cedar leaned into the wind above fresh clay. In the back of his mind, a door long shut creaked open, letting in not noise of war, but the wet snuffle of a foolish brave pup and the careful breathing of his small sister. He turned the key. The engine caught. Gravel ticked under the tires. He eased the truck down Mill Creek Road, wipers cutting the day into manageable pieces. There was no dramatic exit, no perfect words, no cinematic close. Just the hum of an old engine and a man choosing the only honest answer to a question: sometimes you pick it up and carry it home. Inside the cab's pocket of warmth, Valor pressed his muzzle to the map of veins in Silas's wrist. Grace's face disappeared into the wool cave of his jacket cuff. Between those two certainties, something wordless rose and settled in Silas, a vow that needed no witness to be real. The drive stretched longer than usual as the gravel thickened into mud and the rain turned to sleet. Silas kept the heater high, one hand on the wheel, the other hovering near the crate. Valor sprawled half across his sister, paws twitching in dream chasing. Grace remained curled in the jacket lining, her soft breaths fogging wool in rhythm. By the time he pulled into the clearing, the storm had sharpened. His cabin stood, a timber shack of reclaimed boards and a marine's insistence on order, leaning against a line of pines, its stovepipe puffing like a weary smoker. The porch sagged in the middle, window panes cracked from winters past, but inside it was sturdy, gas stove, pot-bellied heater, the smell of cedar oil and iron. He carried the crate first, boots dripping on the rope mat he had braided himself, and set it near the stove. The fire inside was low but alive. He fed it split logs until orange deepened and heat pushed the damp out of his coat. Then he spread a thick merino wool blanket, folding it into a rough nest. The puppies tumbled out with clumsy bravery, Valor nose first, rolling before scrambling up again, Grace slower, stepping with quiet care as though measuring the room. Silas crouched, one knee on the blanket, studying them with the focus of a man who had rebuilt engines but never coaxed life this small. At the counter, he dug into Edith's tote. 2 small bottles with rubber nipples. A tin of powdered formula marked with her sharp handwriting. 1 part powder, 2 parts warm water. Every 3 hours. Rub bellies after. Warm towel first. He read it twice. He found a saucepan, filled it with water, set it on the gas burner. Flame caught, blue and eager. He measured powder, shook bottles, then set them in the hot water. Valor barked, a sharp, high complaint, then padded to the stove as though checking the work. Grace discovered an old boot sock under the bench and curled against it like it was a doll. Silas muttered about bad taste in pillows but left her with it. When the bottles warmed, he tested them against his wrist, remembering Edith's words. Sitting cross-legged, he offered one to Valor. The pup latched greedily, the sucking loud for something so small, paws kneading the air as if trying to climb into the bottle. Silas chuckled low, a sound unused for years. Grace was slower. She sniffed, pulled back, then leaned in and latched carefully. Her tail thumped once against the blanket. Silas steadied the bottle with one hand, rubbed her side with the other, murmuring nonsense that surprised him by sounding like prayer. Halfway through, Valor let go with a wet pop, burping like thunder in miniature. Silas laughed aloud. Then frowned, the second pan on the burner hissed. He had forgotten water boiling. The smell of scorched metal wrinkled his nose. He turned off the flame, waving smoke with his arm. Valor barked again, ears tipped forward as if scolding him. "All right, Sergeant," Silas said, dry. Message received. The word slipped out before he thought, and memory tugged. Platoon days, men who never came back, orders carried across dust. He let the moment pass and turned back to Grace, who had finished half her bottle and was curling into the sock, milk dripping at her chin. Later, both pups fed and their bellies rubbed in slow circles until they wriggled in drowsy relief. Silas wrapped them in the wool blanket and drew them to his chest. The gas stove ticked, the pot-bellied heater cracked, and outside sleet shifted into snow, tapping tin roof to whisper. The cabin filled with scents of warm milk, wet fur, and cedar burning. Silas leaned against the wall, legs stretched, 2 small bodies rising and falling with his breath. Valor twitched, chasing rabbits only he could see. Grace burrowed deeper beneath his chin, her faint whimper turning steady with sleep. The scar on Silas's forearm ached, as it always did with weather. But tonight it dulled under the weight of 2 fragile lives that had claimed him without asking. Before his eyes closed, Silas whispered the names again, Valor and Grace, as though saying them aloud might root them harder into this new life. Snow fell heavier, muting the world into silence. Only the stove's slow exhale and 2 tiny hearts pressed against him broke the hush. For the first time in years, Silas Morgan let himself believe warmth might last. Morning broke sharp and brittle after the storm, the kind of dawn where snow was too white and sky too blue, as though the earth itself insisted on starting clean even if people weren't ready. Silas Morgan had barely slept, rising every few hours to feed Valor and Grace on their schedule. He kept notes in blocky handwriting, times marked, bottles rinsed, rags folded. The rhythm of care was already carving itself into his bones. The pups had made it through the night, warm and round-bellied, their ears twitching at the crackle of the stove. For Silas, that might have been enough. But trouble, as he'd learned in deserts and small towns alike, rarely waits until the strong have rested. It arrived that afternoon, a silver SUV grinding up the muddy track. County plates. From it stepped Sheriff Amos Dwyer, a broad man in his mid-50s whose frame once filled a uniform better than his current paunch. Sandy hair receding but clipped close, his posture was that of a man tempered by years of bar fights broken up and nights spent watching for the next bad call. Dwyer had worn the badge in Silver Creek for nearly a decade. He wasn't cruel, but caution had been carved into him after losing a younger brother to a mill accident. That grief had left him deliberate with rules, reluctant to bend them, clinging to forms and papers to keep order on the bad days. He nodded once. Afternoon. We need to talk. Two others climbed out behind him. The first was a woman with chestnut hair pinned into a precise bun, her coat trimmed in fur, leather boots spotless despite the mud. Lydia Hart, 35. Cousin to the woman whose funeral Silas had stumbled into. Tall, angular, her cheekbones sharp as glass, her face striking if not hardened by judgment. Once a schoolteacher in another county, her marriage had ended bitterly, and she had returned to Silver Creek restless, grasping at whatever piece of family or land might still be hers. Those puppies, she said without greeting, her voice like chalk on slate. They're kin. My aunt bred shepherds for years. They belong with family, not a man alone in the woods. The third figure was younger, wrapped in an animal services windbreaker. Mara Keene, 27. A tablet hugged to her side, hair dyed a rough auburn, wiry strands escaping her ponytail. Fresh out of an animal science program, she had a heart for animals but a strict faith in procedure. She believed the right binder of regulations could spare suffering if only followed. Her eyes softened when they found the pups nosing each other inside, but her voice stayed official. We'll need to perform a health check, vaccines, deworming, temporary hold. Standard process. Silas straightened in the doorway, jacket zipped, boots firm on the porch. He looked from Lydia to Dwyer, his tone level but heavy with certainty. They've eaten. They're warm. They'll make it. You saw what state they were in when no one else stepped up. I'm not saying you didn't save them, Lydia replied, arms crossed, chin tight. But you can't keep them. Family comes first. I have a home, a salary, resources. You've got a cabin, and a record of choosing solitude. Sheriff Dwyer cleared his throat, adjusting his hat against the cold. Silas, law favors blood. Doesn't matter if it's been a week or a month. There's a process. Animal Services needs to do its job. His eyes, though, betrayed something softer, sympathy tugging at the edges of protocol. Mara crouched by the crate, moving with clinical speed. Valor barked once, puffing his tiny chest as if ready to defend his blanket. Grace edged backward into Silas's boot, trembling. Mara jotted weights, checked temperatures, her tablet clicking through data. Underweight, but responsive, she reported. They'll need boosters, dewormer. Overnight observation at the clinic. Silas bent, brushing a rough palm along Grace's back until her shiver steadied. He didn't look at Mara. His gaze stayed locked on Lydia. You weren't at the funeral, he said flatly. You weren't there when they sat in the rain. Snow blocked the pass, Lydia answered, her lips pressing thin. I would have come. Doesn't change the fact I'm blood. A Subaru pulled in then, its engine wheezing. Edith May Robbins climbed out with her canvas satchel slung over one shoulder, cheeks flushed, glasses fogging. She had heard the whispers that travel fast in towns like this, and her presence was intentional, the way a medic answers a call even if no dispatch sent it. "I've been weighing them," she said, handing a folder to Sheriff Dwyer. "Valor's up a pound in 3 days. Grace, half that. Temp steady, stool's fine. He's done better than most foster homes I've seen." Her tone was calm but carried the weight of experience sharpened by long years. Lydia flicked a glance at the folder, unimpressed. "That's anecdotal. They need order. I can provide it." Edith's smile was thin, her voice sharper. "So can he, if what matters is life and not paperwork. But arguments like that never settle on a snowy porch." Sheriff Dwyer rubbed his jaw, weary. "Court'll decide. For now, procedure holds, temporary custody to animal services until hearing. That's the rule." His gaze held Silas's steady. "You can contest it. File an appeal. But right now, they go." Silas knelt fully then, face level with the crate. Valor shoved his nose against Silas's wrist again, a repeat of the gesture that had bound them days ago. Grace pressed herself beneath his hand, wide-eyed, as though clinging to the only truth she knew. For a moment, Silas stayed that way, letting their warmth press into the part of him rules never reach. Then he lifted his face toward Mara. "Let me carry them out." Mara hesitated, then nodded. Cameras blinked on. Standard documentation for transfers. Silas slid the pups back inside the crate, tucking the jacket he'd given them that first day beneath their paws. Valor pawed at the mesh, nose smudging against it. Grace pressed against him, eyes pinned to the man outside. Silas lowered until his nose touched the wire. One last point of contact, a vow without words. The shutter of Mara's camera recorded it into county files. But the real memory burned deeper, sealed between the three of them. Sheriff Dwyer cleared his throat, staring elsewhere. "Court meets Monday. You'll have your chance." Edith rested a hand on Silas's arm briefly, knowing too well the ache of waiting. Lydia turned, satisfied, sliding into the SUV. The crate was lifted. Tires spat slush. The vehicle disappeared down the track, leaving only smoke from Silas's chimney twisting upward like a question without an answer. The nights that followed stretched long and hollow. The cabin seemed wrong in its silence. Snow gathered on the steps, wind rattled the stovepipe, but without Valor's bark or Grace's tiny whimper, the quiet pressed heavy on Silas's chest. He tried to busy himself, sharpening his axe, fixing pantry hinges, stacking kindling, but each time his hands paused, his eyes drifted to the folded wool blanket still waiting in the corner. It was on the third night, as snow fell light and moonlit across the pines, that tires crunched again on frozen gravel. Headlights crawled up the track, then jerked to a stop. Brakes squealed sharp. Silas pulled on his boots, Hart racing ahead of him, and opened the cabin door to the cold. A silver pickup sat crooked at the porch. No one stepped out. Instead, the passenger door swung wide, and a familiar crate was set carefully on the step. The truck reversed, tires spitting slush, gone before Silas moved. He stood there in disbelief. Then he bent. Two pairs of eyes stared back, one bold, one cautious, both awake. Valor shoved his nose through the wire and barked rough with recognition. Grace pressed close, her body quivering not from cold, but from memory of absence. Silas lifted the crate, his hands trembling more than the weight required, and carried it inside. On top lay a folded sheet of lined stationery. He opened it only after setting the pups free into the cabin's warmth. The handwriting was sharp, steady. "They were silent in my house, but they cried the whole way, leaving yours. They belong with you. I'll sign the papers tomorrow. Lydia." Silas stared at the words, then at the pups racing clumsy circles around his boots. A breath he didn't know he was holding left long and uneven. The cabin found its voice again that night. Grace pawed at the wool blanket as though it had never been empty. She curled around a bottle Silas pressed into her mouth, drinking until her eyes half closed, her tail tapping slowly before she drifted into milk-heavy sleep. Valor clamped on Silas's bootlace, growling like he was punishing him for the separation. Silas let him tug until the leather stretched, then scooped him up. "All right, soldier," he muttered, his grin betraying him. "Message received. Don't let it happen again." Valor licked his chin, grumbling, then settled against him. Anger gone as quick as snow melting in sun. Later, as the stove glowed and the fire snapped, Silas warmed formula, fed them both, then rummaged through an old trunk until he found scraps of canvas and cloth. With needle and steady hands, he stitched 2 plain collars, practical, strong. One slipped around Valor's thickening neck. The other around Grace's smaller frame. The sight of them, shepherd pups marked as his beneath firelight, stirred something deeper than relief. It was a claim without seals, a vow beyond courtrooms. Outside, snow fell thicker, hiding the tracks that had delivered the crate. Inside, warmth bloomed, the kettle hissing, the pups curled into Silas's side. Grace rested her chin on the new collar. Valor sprawled across his lap, twitching in dream. On the table, Lydia's note lay beside them. For all her sharpness, she had listened to something more honest than pride. Tomorrow, there would be signatures. Tonight, there was only the fire, the cabin, and the family that had chosen itself. By the time snow crusted into ridges along Mill Creek Road, another visitor came. Silas was stacking kindling by the porch, the pups tumbling around his boots, when a dark sedan rolled to a stop at the gate. The man who stepped out walked like he owned the gravel beneath him. Rhett Karen. Early 40s. Broad-shouldered, polished menace about him. His brown hair slicked back with too much pomade, a thin mustache riding his lip like a smirk he wore on purpose. Folks whispered he'd once run greyhound races down in Texas until the state shut him down for cruelty. After that, he drifted north, where rules bent easier. For years he'd been Barnaby Sloan's right hand, the man sent when charm needed muscle and muscle needed ink. Karen carried a leather folio, tucked under his arm as if it were a weapon. He strode up the porch steps with oily cordiality, every word meant to sound polite but humming with threat. "Mr. Morgan," he said, tapping the folio. "I represent Barnaby Sloan. You've got property that belongs to him. 2 shepherd pups, bred from his lines. I've got papers, signed and notarized. Breeding rights. They come with me today." Silas folded his arms, his expression flat. Behind him, Valor barked from the doorway, suspicion already fixed on the stranger. Grace pressed against Silas's boot, ears twitching. "They aren't property," Silas said evenly. "And they sure as hell aren't yours." Karen opened the folio with showmanship, sliding out typed forms, cheap seals stamped, signatures scrawled. "Sloan's kennel has claim. Black and white." Before Silas could reply, the rattle of Edith May's Subaru cut through the air. She parked sideways in the yard and climbed out, canvas satchel slung over her shoulder. Her glasses caught what little sun filtered through the cold. Her eyes narrowed when she saw Karen. "Barnaby sending his errand boy?" she asked dryly. "Not a surprise." Karen's smirk faltered. "Just business, document papers are papers." Edith ignored him. She stepped onto the porch, pulled a folder from her bag, and handed it straight to Sheriff Amos Dwyer, arriving minutes later in his county cruiser, drawn by Edith's earlier call. The sheriff flipped through the folder, his breath fogging in the chill. The contents cut sharper than any seal on Karen's documents, photographs of dogs in wire cages too tight to turn in, vaccination slips from fake clinics, receipts of litters sold without medical checks. Edith's tone was crisp, unwavering. "I've been in that kennel. Half those dogs are underweight. Worms untreated. Records falsified. He pushes them out sick for a faster profit. Dwyer's jaw tightened as he read, weariness written deep in the lines of his face. He'd seen too much of this kind of wrong, justice always slower than it should be. Finally, he closed the folder with a snap. Karen, take those papers back to Sloan. This isn't finished, but you're not walking away with the pups today. Karen bristled, his lips twitching between a sneer and a grin. You think this'll stick? Sloan's got friends deeper than this county. Silas stepped forward, tall enough to block Karen from the doorway's light. Then tell him to send more than paper. He won't find an open door here. Karen slammed the folio shut, stomped back to his sedan. His taillights bled red into the gray sky until he vanished down the hill. That night, Silas circled the cabin with a new eye. Trouble had announced itself. He would not leave an open path back. He mounted an old brass bell over the door, wired a pawnshop camera to cover the porch, and nailed planks across the back window. Inside, he trained the pups. He handed Valor a scrap of cloth Karen had left on the porch. The pup sniffed, wrinkled his nose, then barked sharp and low. Silas crouched, rubbing his ears. That's right. Learn it. That scent means trouble. Grace watched from the blanket. Silas raised his palm flat. Stay, he said firmly. She blinked, shifted, then sat still. He repeated until she obeyed without hesitation, her tail only thumping after his hand lowered. Valor learned to track the cloth hidden around the yard, circling until he found it and barking sharp when he did. Grace practiced patience, staying grounded while Valor dashed past. Together, boldness and calm began to shape into skill. Training steadied Silas as much as the dogs. Rhythm returned to the cabin, a beat to match against the hum of threats outside. Later that week, Sheriff Dwyer returned, pulling his cruiser into the clearing under a sky stretched with cold clouds. He stepped out with a stamped envelope in hand. I filed for a protective order, he said. Judge Fairlight's reviewing it. If it passes, Sloan can't touch them until the case is heard. His eyes shifted toward the cabin, where the pups barked and wrestled, then back to Silas. You've done good work. Keep them close. Silas nodded, a weight lifting slightly. Edith, who had stopped by with kibble and her usual dry wit, clapped Dwyer's arm. About time law caught up with decency, she muttered. That night, after the fire settled low, Silas sat by the window watching snow fall in soft sheets. Valor sprawled across his boots, Grace curled into his arm. Silence hung taut, stretched thin as wire. Just past midnight, headlights swept across the pines. Gravel cracked beneath heavy tires crawling up Mill Creek Road. Silas rose without a sound, scooped both pups into his arms, and carried them into the back room. His heart pounded as tires ground closer, lights sliding slow across the cabin wall. The world outside was too quiet. Only the headlights moved, cutting across frost and shadow. Dawn broke silver and brittle, frost turning every pine branch into glass. Silas had been up long before first light, stoking the stove, boiling water for formula. Valor gnawed happily on a scrap of rope near the hearth, paws now too big for the patch of blanket they once shared. Grace dozed across Silas's lap, the faint hum of contentment rising from her chest each time he shifted. For a while, it almost felt like a morning untouched by threats. Then tires cracked over frozen gravel. The same black sedan. Red Karen stepped out, arrogance clinging to him like his coat collar raised against the cold. The leather folio was tucked under his arm again, his face sharper now, lines cut deeper by anger. He stomped up the porch, his voice sharp as a slap. I'm here for the pups. This time with orders. He slapped the folio against his palm like a gavel about to fall. Before his hand reached the porch rail, another vehicle turned up the track, a county SUV, white-striped, lights flashing once in warning. Deputy Clara Jennings climbed out. Early 30s, tall and lean, her dark braid pulled tight beneath her hat. Her uniform was crisp, body cam clipped to her chest, radio crackling faint static. She carried herself with the quiet certainty of someone who wore the badge as shield, not weapon. Daughter of a logger lost in a mill collapse, Clara's sense of fairness was stubborn and unbending. She stepped forward, holding a sealed envelope with the county seal embossed. Her voice was steady, not loud but carrying weight. "Step back, Karen." She handed Silas the envelope, then read it aloud for the camera. By order of Silver Creek County Court, 1, Lydia Hart has formally relinquished all claims to custody of the German Shepherd Pups, notarized and filed. 2, temporary custodianship is granted to Silas Morgan until final hearing. 3, Animal Services shall microchip and register the animals under his name immediately. The word struck like iron. Silas's throat tightened. Grace stirred in his arm as though she understood permanence had just been spoken. Valor barked once, tail thumping in agreement. Karen's face flushed red. "This is a sham. Sloan won't stand for it." "You'll stand down," Clara cut in. "Body cam is live. Any interference goes straight into evidence." Before he could spit another word, headlights dotted the track. A slow trickle of townsfolk arrived, Mrs. Glay from the bakery with a basket of warm rolls, the blue-haired kid with a thermos of coffee, ranch hands leaning silent against the fence rail. In a place like Silver Creek, showing up was louder than shouting. Edith May came too, climbing out of her Subaru with her canvas satchel. She carried it straight to Silas's porch rail, snapping it open with brisk efficiency. Inside were syringes, cotton swabs, a handheld scanner. "Let's get this done," she said, crouching to Valor's level. Her eyes softened, though her hands stayed steady. Sheriff Dwyer arrived last, his cruiser grumbling up the slope. He stepped out with the weary weight of a man who had already signed too many warrants. "Karen," he said, low. "County's moving on Sloan's kennel today. Inspections, records, the whole lot. I'd suggest you drive south before the law starts asking about your name on falsified contracts." Karen's jaw worked, but silence was his only weapon now. Edith clipped Valor's scruff, slid the microchip needle under his skin with practiced ease, pressed the injector. The scanner beeped, soft and decisive. "ID, Morgan, Valor," she read aloud. The words hung like a banner no one could tear down. Grace was next, quieter, smaller, but no less certain. Another beep. "ID, Morgan, Grace." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Glay dabbed her eyes with her apron. Even Sheriff Dwyer cleared his throat more than once, tugging his hat lower. Karen tried to muster a last stand. "This isn't over." "No," Clara said, her braids swinging as she turned. "It's the start of doing things right." She tapped her body cam. "Now leave, or trespass gets added to your file." Karen slammed his folio shut, stalked back to the sedan, and drove off, snow and gravel spitting behind him. On the porch, Valor tugged Silas's bootlace again, triumphant. Grace curled against his shin, ears twitching at the hum of voices around them. Silas knelt, scratching both sets of ears, his eyes lifting to Edith, then to Sheriff Dwyer, then to the gathered faces. Something steadier than relief settled in him, a recognition that this fight was no longer just his. Inside the cabin, the stove popped, spilling heat into the room. Outside, the beeps of the scanner lingered in memory, the sound of two small lives finally no longer adrift. Winter yielded slowly that year. Snow lingered in the pines' shadows, but soft ground broke open in patches, pushing green shoots through thaw. Each day carried more sun, and each day Valor and Grace stretched taller, their paws clumsy with youth, their energy unspent. Silas began shaping their play into lessons. Out in the clearing, he tucked a worn leather glove beneath a log and let Valor find it. The pup, now nearly 5 months, was dark sable with streaks of lighter gray, his eyes bright amber. Restless by nature, he would charge through brush, nose low, tail whipping, then freeze at the scent. Barking sharp and insistent, he'd look back for Silas's nod. Good find, Silas praised, rubbing the strong ridge of his back. It was no longer just a game, it was discipline forming. Grace trained differently. Smaller, quieter, her coat lighter along the sides, her eyes holding a thoughtful calm. Silas taught her to stay with a flat palm raised, to heel with the turn of his wrist, to return at a snap of fingers. Grace never rushed, she observed first, then obeyed, her movements deliberate as though she carried her name inside her. Together, Valor and Grace balanced each other, one bold, one measured. And with Silas, their rhythm wove into a team, 3 breaths moving in sync. One crisp morning, Sheriff Dwyer pulled into the yard, papers tucked beneath his arm, a faint smile hidden in his beard. News from the courthouse, he said, leaning on the porch rail. He handed over an envelope stamped with the county seal. Inside, the judgment was plain, custodial ownership of Valor and Grace awarded to Silas Morgan, full registration filed with Animal Services. Silas read it slowly, almost as if afraid the ink might vanish. Valor nosed the paper, smudging it with a damp paw. Grace pressed against his leg, as if she too recognized the permanence in the words. That afternoon Edith May arrived, basket of biscuits in hand, her cardigan buttoned crookedly, glasses slipping down her nose. Practical as ever, she pulled a pen from her satchel and spread the papers on the porch railing. Time to make it official, she said. Silas signed his name in a steady hand. Edith dipped Valor's paw into a shallow tray of ink and pressed it at the bottom of the page, sharp print and claws. Grace's followed, lighter, softer. There, Edith declared, satisfied. Better sealed than any county clerk dreamed of. Life settled into rhythm. Silas patched the cabin roof with neighbors' help. Hank Whitlow, gray-bearded carpenter with barn-building hands, oversaw the work. New ridge beam by summer, he muttered, eye sharp as ever. Mrs. Glay tied a small wind chime to the porch post, its tin pieces cut from old baking sheets. When the breeze stirred, the sound was delicate, laughter in glass. Valor, ever the fool, discovered his reflection one evening in the windowpane. He lunged, barked, and wagged, convinced another dog challenged him. Silas laughed so hard he had to catch the doorframe to steady himself. Grace, unimpressed, stole one of his gloves in protest. It became ritual, each time Silas reached for dog shampoo, she whisked away the glove, hiding it beneath the blanket until the dreaded bath passed. But humor and chores couldn't dull the weight of the court paper now framed by the stove. Sheriff Dwyer returned a week later with the final certificate, names, registration numbers, and Silas's signature pressed under the embossed seal. Keep it safe, Dwyer advised, though his tone suggested no one would dare challenge it now. On a Saturday morning, the community gathered on the porch. Coffee in mugs, stories swapped. Edith held up the certificate, the inked paw prints bold against Silas's name. Neighbors clapped, the chime tinkled, and the pups barked as if the sound itself belonged to them. Silas looked down at Valor, chest puffed, and Grace, leaning quiet at his knee, and felt the truth settle deep. Not just guardianship. Not just survival. This was family, earned through sleepless nights, warm bottles, and the steady weight of breath shared in storms. Spring swelled full, the creek rushing louder with melt, when the call came through. A child had gone missing near Rockbend Creek, 8 years old, last seen chasing a stray baseball into the woods behind the schoolyard. The alarm carried fast in a town where everyone knew every face. By dusk, half of Silver Creek had gathered in boots and jackets, flashlights in hand. Silas arrived with Valor and Grace at his side, both leashed but buzzing with energy. Sheriff Dwyer met him at the trailhead, clipboard in one hand, radio in the other. His face was drawn, the kind of tight only fear for a child can carve. Boy's name is Eli Geller, Dwyer said. Son of the mill foreman. Wandered off around 4. Been gone near 3 hours. Neighbors fanned into lines, flashlights sweeping like restless fireflies. The creek's roar carried over stone, loud enough to swallow a small boy's cry. Silas crouched, unhooked Valor's lead, and pulled the boy's sweatshirt from Dwyer's truck bed. "Smelled it yet?" he asked, pressing it low. Valor buried his nose deep, tail lashing, body vibrating with focus. Grace circled once, ears pricked, reading the woods as if they were a map written for her alone. Dwyer hesitated. "You sure they're ready?" Silas's voice was steady. "They've been ready since the storm." He dropped his hand. Valor surged forward, nose skimming low, weaving through brambles with single-minded drive. Grace moved quieter but kept glancing back, her eyes not just on trail but on the shadows, listening for what silence might hide. The searchers followed. Boots snapped twigs, radios crackled updates. Silas jogged close behind, calling low commands, "Track, Valor. Stay close, Grace." Minutes stretched long. Then Valor barked sharp, darting left toward the creek. Silas pushed through underbrush, branches slapping his arms. There, at the bank's edge, small sneaker prints pressed into mud, half filled with water. "He crossed here," Silas shouted. Dwyer relayed it over radio, directing teams downriver. Grace whined, tugging Silas back upstream. He paused, listening. Beyond the roar of the creek, faint as a breath, came a child's sob. "This way," Silas said, trusting her. They scrambled along the bank, rocks slick, water spitting spray. Valor leapt ahead, barking in short bursts, guiding them to a fallen log wedged against stone. There, huddled beneath the log's arch, soaked to the bone, was Eli Geller. His knees hugged his chest, face pale with fear. One sneaker gone, his lips blue. Grace pressed forward first, low and gentle, licking his hand as though to remind him he wasn't alone. Valor barked, circling, drawing light and voices toward them. Silas slid down the embankment, knees sinking into mud. "Easy, kid. You're safe now." He peeled off his jacket, wrapped it around Eli's shaking frame, then hoisted him up. The boy clung to his neck with the desperate grip of survival. Dwyer arrived seconds later, his flashlight beam catching the boy's face. His breath broke with relief. "We've got him. Call it in, we've got him." Voices erupted across radios. Searchers cheered down the line. Someone fired a flare into the sky, its red bloom painting the trees. Back at the trailhead, EMTs checked Eli, wrapping him in blankets, sliding an oxygen mask over his face. His father, Foreman Geller, stumbled forward, tears streaking grime as he pulled his son close. "Thank you," he rasped to Silas, then knelt to hug the pups who had found his boy. Valor licked the man's hands, Grace leaned into his chest. The crowd gathered, murmurs swelling into praise. Sheriff Dwyer raised his voice, steady but thick with emotion. "Remember tonight, who saved him." He gestured to Valor and Grace, then to Silas. Mrs. Glade pressed her apron to her mouth, whispering thanks. Ranch hands clapped Silas's shoulders. Edith, standing quiet at the edge, simply nodded once, her eyes shining behind her glasses. Later, back at the cabin, Silas fed the pups an extra helping, watching them sprawl satisfied on the rug. The fire glowed low, the creek's roar distant now, softened by walls and warmth. He sat with them, hand resting on their backs, and let himself feel it fully, what they had done, what they had become. Not strays. Not burdens. Not temporary. Partners. Outside, the wind stirred the pines. Inside, Valor and Grace slept heavy, paws twitching, dreams chasing whatever good scent lay ahead. Silas whispered their names into the quiet, a prayer, a promise, and a truth now shared by an entire county. The rescue at Rockbend Creek carried farther than Silver Creek's borders. By week's end, the county paper ran a front-page photo, Silas kneeling in mud, Eli Geller clinging to his neck, Valor barking mid-frame, Grace pressed to the boy's side. The headline was plain but proud, "Shepherd Save Boy, local veteran and dogs called heroes. Sheriff Dwyer brought copies to the cabin, laying them on Silas's table with a faint smile. "First time this paper printed good news before bad in 10 years, he said. Edith May arrived with cookies, though she pretended they were for the pups. "Heroes need calories," she said, slipping Valor one while Grace nosed her satchel for a second. The town gathered the following Saturday at the fairgrounds, a spring event usually meant for livestock shows and pie contests. This time, the crowd pressed close to a makeshift stage. Children waved cardboard cutouts shaped like shepherd ears. Ranchers leaned on the fence rails, their boots lined with mud but their voices carrying warmth. Sheriff Dwyer stepped up with the county commissioner. Valor sat at Silas's left, chest puffed, ears sharp. Grace leaned quietly against his right leg, her calm steadying the noise. "On behalf of Silver Creek County," the commissioner declared, "we recognize Valor and Grace, shepherds whose service saved a child's life. And we recognize their guardian, Silas Morgan, for raising them with discipline and devotion." A ribbon was placed around each pup's neck, simple cloth, county seal stitched by a local quilter. Valor tried to bite his, convinced it was a toy. Grace wore hers solemn, eyes bright as if she knew weight hid in the gesture. Applause rolled across the field, cheers rising. Children crowded forward, reaching to touch soft ears. Silas let them, his voice low as he reminded, gentle hands. Valor wagged furiously. Grace leaned into small palms with patient grace. For Silas, the noise blurred. What cut clear was the sight, neighbors laughing, children safe, his dog steady beside him. For years, he had carried silence thick as armor. Now it cracked, replaced not by noise of war but by the sound of belonging. That night, back at the cabin, firelight painted the walls gold. Valor sprawled heavy across the rug, legs twitching in dream, tail thumping now and then. Grace curled smaller at Silas's side, her head tucked beneath his hand, her breath warm against his wrist where a scar once marked loss. Silas sat long into the evening, the county ribbon folded on the table, the framed certificate above the stove, the paw prints inked into permanence. He thought of men he had buried overseas, names etched on walls. He thought of nights when return felt heavier than departure. And then he thought of two lives that had touched his hand in a storm, one bold, one gentle, both pulling him forward. He whispered their names, Valor, Grace, as if each syllable was a nail holding his world steady. They stirred, barely, and pressed closer. Outside, the creek rushed on, endless and strong. Inside, warmth held. This was no longer about rescue. No longer about paperwork, threats, or trials. It was about a man and two dogs who had chosen each other, not by blood or by law, but by something deeper, an unspoken vow carved in storm, sealed in quiet, and proven in fire and river. In Silver Creek, folks would go on telling the story, about the Marine who lifted a crate at a grave, about the pups who grew into more than companions, about the family that began on a night most thought was ending. But in the cabin, with snow still clinging in shadows and spring pushing green through the thaw, the story was simpler. A man. Two shepherds. A bond unshakable as the pines that rooted them. And that was enough.